If you've lived in California within the last decade, then you're probably pretty aware of the fact that wildfires become a problem in California. But it wasn't always this way. The Native Americans not only learned how to live with fire, but to even use it to their advantage. Here's just a few examples of how the Native Americans used fire to their advantage. So one way was they would burn the fuels around their villages so that a fire wouldn't just be able to sweep through the village. It's almost like a protective barrier, kind of like a moat. Now, other things they would do is burn to promote certain types of plants, whether those plants were for food or maybe for different materials that they'd use for basket weaving. They could use fire for that. They would also use it to signal people at distances, so almost like a form of communication. They would use it in warfare. And then what I think is the most interesting example is they would even use it for hunting game. Now, I forget where I heard this story, but imagine a hill. They would light fires all around that hill, and then fire likes to travel uphill. The reason for that is it preheats the fuels above it because heat rises. And then there's also flame tilting, so the flame is actually closer to the plants on ahead of it on the hill or above it on the hill. So then by the time the flame gets there, those fuels are just ready to combust. The flame goes faster uphill. So you could think of this little circle of fire going up the hill. And then what would happen is any game that was on that hill at the time, whether it was rabbits or deer, would have a smaller and smaller circle of fire kind of enclosing around them. So then the Native Americans would be able to go to the top of the hill. Once that circle was pretty small, all the game would be surrounded, and then they'd take out their bow and arrows. Just a pretty quick, easy shot. So just thought that was an interesting example of how the Native Americans didn't view fire as the enemy or that there was a war against fire. They just viewed it as a natural part of the environment that they could even learn to live with. And when I say it's a natural part of the environment, that's because I'm talking about the Native Americans that lived in California. And California, wildfire is just a part of California. And the reason that it is because we have a Mediterranean climate. That's where you have wet winters and dry summers. So the reason that promotes wildfire is because at the hottest time of the year, it's also the driest time of the year. And one of the most well-known fire weather indices, something that predicts fire danger, it's literally called hot, dry, windy. So during the summers, we're hot and dry. And then during fall in California, we start to have some offshore wind events. So then it's hot, dry, and windy. So fire is just a natural part of the California ecosystem. Now, where things kind of turned around in how Californians lived with fire was in the early 1900s. There were some massive wildfires up in Idaho and Montana, and this kind of shifted the collective consciousness from living with fire to fire is the enemy, and kind of a policy of complete fire exclusion. This is really put forward by the Forest Service, where if a fire popped up, they tried to put it out as fast as possible. Now, one interesting thing I actually learned today is one of the groups that was arguing against this policy of fire exclusion, which we now know doesn't work, was the timber industry, not out of any altruistic reasons, but because they knew it would clear out some of the smaller fuels, promote a healthier forest, just long enough for when they were ready to clear out some of the old growth trees. But they didn't really win that battle, and fire exclusion became the norm in California. So because of that, there's been this period of fire suppression, and then what happens is without fire, the fire that should be part of the California ecosystem, the fuels that would have burned are able to accumulate. And then because those fuels accumulate, when you finally do have a fire, which eventually you will, whether it's from lightning or the more likely cause, whether it's from people starting the fire. I think about 90% of wildfires are started by humans, and there's more people moving into the wildland-urban interface every single day. If those fuels are built up, eventually that spark is going to happen, and then it just turns into a massive fire, where in the past you could have just had smaller fires periodically clearing out those fuels. Now, this idea was put forward in the 1950s and 60s by two people named Harold. There was Harold Weaver, who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then Harold Biswell, who worked for UC Berkeley. And they just put forward this idea that, yeah, if there's a fire moving towards a city, yeah, we should suppress it. You don't just let it go through the city. And we should maybe even still try to prevent wildfires, especially at times when we don't want them. But fire is actually a very necessary part of the California ecosystem, and it's not only good for humans, but it's also good for the forest itself. And that's where this idea of forest health comes in. This was really promoted in the 1980s, where because of all of this fire exclusion, you're having a buildup of all of these fuels. And then let's say, I'm just going to throw out some numbers. Let's say on an acre of land, the natural ecosystem would have been sustaining 10 trees. And then maybe if like 10 more trees were popping up, then a fire comes through, it clears those out. The older ones survive until they're weak, and then maybe those get burned out. And then it just finds this balance where there's 10 trees per acre. But then what happens when you have the fire exclusion put forward by the Forest Service throughout the early 1900s and all the fuels are able to accumulate, all of a sudden on that same parcel of land, there's now, let's say, 1,000 trees. But the problem is that those 1,000 trees are all sharing the same amount of water that the much smaller amount of trees in the past would have been sharing. So because of that, the trees are weakened because they don't have as much water, and then that makes them much more likely to, it makes them weaker. So then things like pests or insects or diseases can have a much more negative effect on them, and then you end up having a lot of dead trees. And this is something we've seen up in the Sierra. There's millions of dead trees in the Sierra right now because of this. There's too many trees, they're sharing too little water, and then they are more susceptible to pests, disease, and then they die, and then you just have millions of dead, dry trees just waiting to explode into a giant fire. So the idea that Harold Biswell was putting forward and Harold Weaver were putting forward in the 1950s was the right one. But at the time, it was kind of controversial what they were saying. Now, luckily, since then, we've been able to kind of feel the impacts of fire exclusion, and we are starting to introduce a lot more prescribed fire into the landscape. But I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture because the wildfire situation in California is still pretty bad. We still have had a lot of fuels building up. There's still a lot more fuels to burn. There's still millions of dead trees up in the Sierra. But I feel like the tide is starting to shift and people are starting to understand that prescribed fire is actually maybe not only good, but necessary. Now, I don't want to just say it's good because there are positives and negatives to prescribed fire. So let's go over some of the negatives. The most obvious one is it is a liability. So if you put fire on the ground on purpose, or let's say you have a policy where like a lightning fire starts and then it's not threatening anybody, so you just kind of let it burn, let the California ecosystem do its thing. There is a danger there. The danger there is that the fire that you either start on purpose or you allow to burn, conditions change, it becomes out of control, and then a small fire that you could have easily put out turns into a major blaze that then threatens life and property. That's a pretty hard decision to make, to say, let's let this fire burn. It doesn't look like it's that close to the community, and then maybe a week later the winds turn on, and if the community's taken out, then obviously that's a very bad thing. The other thing is prescribed fire. If you're putting fire on the ground, things are burning, that puts some smoke into the air, so then you also have complaints from people who don't like the bad air quality. Now that one I think is a kind of both of these are short-sighted approaches because it's California. Wildfire is just a natural part of our ecosystem. So from the air quality perspective, if you have a prescribed fire, there might be a little smoke, but if you allow those fuels to build up for decades, there's going to be a huge fire, and then there's going to be a lot of smoke. So it's not a matter of if, but when. And then it's also a question of how do you want it to be? Do you want small fires with a little smoke, and kind of more periodic? Or do you want it maybe a bit more spaced out, but then massive fires that are much more dangerous and end up having much worse air quality. Now, I would say those are the main arguments against prescribed fire. Another one you could maybe argue that it would be bad for some species, but again, a lot of the species in California have actually evolved with fire and they actually depend on fire. But that's where you really get into the nuance, and it's maybe different for whatever county you're talking about. Not going to get into that right now. Some of the arguments for prescribed fire, I'll just go over the first one that pops into my head because it stems off of some of those dangers that are brought up. And it's that we now have the best technology that we've ever had to be able to do these prescribed fires successfully and safely. So not only talking about the amazing firefighting resources we have out there, but also our ability to forecast what the fire is going to do. I had studied and got my master's in meteorology under the Fire Weather Research Laboratory, and at this laboratory we have what's called Wildfire, where you can take the fire perimeter, all of the weather conditions that are forecast for the day, all the fuel conditions, and it actually simulates how that fire is going to burn and where it's going to burn throughout the day. So if somebody is planning a prescribed fire and they say, okay, let's put our fire right here, what's going to happen? If it's one of those days where the model is showing the fire is going to blow up, they just won't do a prescribed fire that day. Or if it's maybe going to blow smoke directly into a city, they just wait for a day where it's much more favorable conditions, or maybe the smoke is going to be blown away from the city. So our technology has massively improved. But even more than that, prescribed fire is also just the best way to promote a healthy forest, reduce fire danger, and interestingly enough, it's also smart economically. So I'll try to go into all three of those. The idea that it's good for the forest health ties back to what I was saying earlier. If you just have thousands of trees popping up where there's not enough water for all of them to share, that's not a healthy forest. And for proof of that, you can go to either the Sierra or the Rockies and see just the millions of dead trees up there. And it's just not how California is naturally supposed to be. And then the argument about reducing fire danger, that is pretty intuitive as well. If you allow fuels to build up, there's more fuels to burn, and then you end up having just a massive fire that is much harder to suppress and control than periodic small fires. Now the interesting one though is it's also smart economically to do prescribed fire or to allow some fires to burn. The reason for that is if you do prescribed fire, I don't know the exact numbers, maybe $100,000 up to maybe $1 million for a big one, and you clear out some of the fuels, that significantly reduces the chances that you're going to have a big wildfire there in the future. And I've seen this during some of my wildfire forecasting where a fire will be moving forward, just maybe it's an extreme wildfire, but then I turn on fire history and I can see there's a burn scar, maybe in the path of that fire. If that burn scar, so where there was fire history or a fire recently burned in the past, if that had burned in the last maybe 5 to 10 years and a lot of those fuels have been cleared out, the current fire will bump into that burn scar perimeter, and then a lot of the times it just stops in its tracks. So then we end up with all these little puzzle pieces of wildfires in California. And that's the same thing you're trying to mimic with prescribed fire. You clear out of a lot of the fuels, and then it makes it less likely that some current fire would be able to just run wild. Now where this gets into economics is if you just do some small prescribed fire, you might have some expenses, but it's going to be nowhere near as expensive as it is to suppress a massive wildfire or a fire that goes so out of control because of all the fuels that have built up that it takes out entire communities and is a massive threat to life. So one of those fires can cost billions of dollars. So it's actually much smarter economically to put fire on the ground and fight fire with fire. So we've talked about a lot throughout this, kind of how Native Americans lived with fire, how we had a period of fire exclusion, and then things are sort of starting to shift around right now, but we do still have a lot of problems out there. Like I mentioned, there are still a lot of fuels. We've had a great wildfire season this year, but it's California. Eventually we're going to dry out again, and then all the rainfall that we've picked up in the past, which grew a lot more plants, eventually those plants will dry out. We'll be right back to where we were in around 2020. So it's a very complex problem. I'm not going to pretend to have all of the answers right now, but that is definitely something that I'm going to dedicate much of my life to trying to figure out. Number of reasons for that. There's something about this idea of living with fire that just kind of feels right to me. But even more than that, I love California. I've lived here my whole life. I plan on living here my entire life. This seems to be one of the big problems, and it's just kind of a problem that, I don't know, you could say it calls to me as something that I can step up and try to take some responsibility for. So moving forward, I'm going to be trying to do these wildfire insider videos all the time. I'm going to be going mostly off of this textbook, which is Fire in California's Ecosystems. It's the most comprehensive work that's been put together on this topic. I'm going to be going through that. I don't know how long it's going to take me. It's a massive textbook. But yeah, if you want to learn more about wildfire in California, you can come on this journey with me. And thanks for watching.